Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, and today we're continuing Dragon Month. We're going to continue with Galakrond, and then next time I'll be discussing the Rin Dynasty. Galakrond apparently was once a benevolent proto-dragon, which this was something in my previous dragon video I wasn't aware of. Dug a bit deeper, I found out that apparently at the dawn of the Aspects era, he was pretty friendly with the others, but he was corrupted by Yogg-Saron, who had corrupted the waters from which Galakrond drank from. The very idea of water being a corrupting factor here is an inversion of the Christian and Roman concept of baptism or of the Janus rituals, wherein your sins were purified via water. And this aspect of these Western religions, dating back, as said, to the Roman era, wherein water was used as a purifying agent for you spiritually, with Warcraft using the idea as a corruptive force, is pretty interesting. But it also harkens back to the original era of the wars of Warcraft, which is to say the blood of Manaroth and how it corrupted the orcs. So the idea itself is pretty interesting and pretty thematic in the literature of Warcraft. But apparently Galakrond seized the prey of his peers, and soon Galakrond would begin to hunt in areas he had never hunted before, as he had a designated territory. However, Galakrond worsened this by beginning the practice of cannibalism, with a great many of those that Galakrond went on to eat becoming undead themselves, Dracoliches, and they were dubbed the Not Living and were enslaved to the corrupted Galakrond's will. Galakrond not only did this, but also ended up inspiring some of the madder proto-dragons, such as Koros, to begin emulating his behavior. These dragons hoped that Galakrond might show them mercy and not go after them, with Galakrond soon betraying Koros, for example. Fellow traitors, because why not? Galakrond seems to have operated at this point in the story more like a mad dog, so to speak, having developed essentially the equivalent, I think, of rabies for dragons. Thematically, as said, it harkens back to the blood of Manaroth. It seems that Galakrond would in the end be pulled into a series of battles with the living dragons, and that he was eventually defeated. Apparently he regained his senses, only to find himself unable to find prey, as the living had become adept at hiding from him. Being a fairly gluttonous dragon, Galakrond soon began to eat his not living dragons. Kept a few alive because why not? You need them for scouting. The Aspects took the fight to him in a battle that would become known as the Dragon Blight. Galakrond apparently would end up defeated via cunning, as a boulder was lodged in the middle of the battle by Maligos in his throat, and then Neltharion blasted an undead dragon into that hole in his throat, and Galakrond choked to death, with the Aspects claiming that Galakrond had been corrupted by the Titans, which do think there's a valid case to be made given the corruptive waters that were fed to Galakrond. That being said, it would be sometime. There are several major things we can discern from this story of Galakrond. For one thing, the fact that him going outside of his territory was regarded as shocking and as something to be horrified about shows that the dragons were originally fairly territorial, based on essentially their hierarchy, which could be determined via who was the best hunter, who was the strongest, who was the cleverest. The idea is that they were primitive, I guess you could say. They were functioning more like a tribal society to an extent, although everybody was still pretty solo. The shock of Galakrond's sudden fall into madness that drove them to really change how they did things. The entire dynamic got thrown out the window because he fell to madness. What is more is that thematically here we see a bit of a anti-baptism in a way, I guess you could say, and this hearkening to the blood of Manaroth, with Galakrond the first to really be corrupted in the history of Azeroth. This corruption is to hint at what's to come, but it also shows the history to kind of operate. I know George Lucas often gets mockery for this, but it operates like poetry. Basically, there's a rhythm to the story. You have at the beginning the corruption of one of the dragons from a relatively normal person, so to speak, into a monster. So you get the same kind of thing with a lot of the orcs. But we do have to look at that poetry thing, not in mockery, but in seriousness. Because mockery is simply, in the case of Warcraft, I think it is true. Medicine was a writer who liked to go back and have a certain rhythm to his story. The thing about fantasy is that it's derived from medieval literature and mythology, so there must be a certain poetic rhythm to the story. I know that a lot of stories today don't have that kind of poetic rhythm, and it's been banished from fantasy for decades, it seems. But in traditional fantasy, it was a constant. And while WoW has kind of fallen away from that and from classical fantasy, if one just looks at the original 3 Warcraft games, there was that kind of thematic idea of a rhythm to the universe. That being said, you have the fact that Galakrond later, when he was uncorrupted, chose to remain a monster. Here we kind of have a bit of a Victor and Adam Frankenstein thing, in that Adam Frankenstein had the choice to be a monster or not. Initially maybe not, but later he certainly had the choice, and then he chose that to be a monster. He wanted that. So with Galakrond, it's implied to be the same kind of thing. At least that's what I think and I've observed here. But back to the story. These efforts would ultimately prove to be Galakrond's bloodline apparently continuing to the current day in the shape of Galakris and the warlord Zayla. The tale of Galakrond shows him to have been a fairly brutal figure who, while initially not so dangerous, became corrupted and was driven into madness. The only thing is that archetypally, one can already see that he was nowhere near the type of figure that Galakrond from Tolkien's Legendarium was. Where Galakrond was clearly a shadow magician archetype of sorts, Galakrond was very clearly a shadow warrior archetype. A gargantuan dragon who was only concerned with satisfying his own whims and hunger, so that it's rather interesting that he has more in common with Ungoliant and Shelob as a character than Galakrond, despite the semi-name similarity between the two. It would seem that the progenitor of dragons, as he's called, archetypally was the shadow warrior, in the context that he, of course, waged war. He seemed to have turned into a bully. He was a sadistic monster. Did not really care who he crushed along the way and who he ate, so long as his hunger and his desires were satisfied. In this way, I think he also reminds me very strongly of the Dragon High Lord, or the Emperor of Dragon High Lords from Dragonlance. Characters such as Ariakis from Dragonlance, who very much is concerned solely with his own desires and wants. But ultimately, Galakrond fell due to his own impulsiveness and his own madness that had gripped him since he drank the corruptive waters. So I hope this video was helpful in expanding on your knowledge of Warcraft. I must say that I learned quite a bit about the mythology myself. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button, as though you were the king of the undead, Arthas himself, taking down Sylvanas.